Today's video is the urgent upgrade I just can't afford, which is actually cheaper on the face of it than most other upgrades, but when you get under the skin it isn't cheap at all. This is the suspension upgrade. It gets expensive when you have to do the front and the rear. And again, I'll be comparing the Speedmaster with a Sportster because that's what I've come from, but also a Bobber because the Triumph Bobber and the Triumph Speedmaster, they're basically the same bikes with different trousers on. And the reason I need to change the suspension is back pain. On the front of the Speedmaster, the forks in 2018, they were 41mm KYB forks and they had 90mm or 3.5 inches of travel. In 2021, that was changed to 47mm Showa cartridge forks. I've got no real idea exactly what that means, but it doesn't matter for us today. Certainly on the Bobber, the fork travel is quoted as being the same, 90mm or 3.5 inches, and I assume it's the same on the Speedmaster because they're the same forks. On the rear, on the Bobber and the Speedmaster, there's the monoshock. That's the KYB, which has 72mm or 2.8 inches of travel. Somehow on the Bobber, it's quoted as 77mm and 3 inches of travel. I've no idea why that is different, but that's what the specifications show. Now, on a Speedmaster and on the Bobber, the monoshock suspension is actually the hypotenuse of a triangle. It's the long side, and that is 270mm long. Now, the problem for me, it's not the handling. I don't need to change suspension because the handling is insufficient or what have you. It's not. The handling is, quite frankly, amazing, especially for a cruiser. But either way, this isn't a racer, this isn't a sports bike. It doesn't need to be super duper handling, diving into every corner. A cruiser, for me, needs to be a soft, comfy ride. And for me, again, the suspension is too hard. Apparently many have noted it, but for me especially, it is just painful at times. And it feels like the suspension is bottoming out. As it hits lumps, it crunches to the bottom, and then as it rebounds, it tops out. That's what it feels like, and the roads around here, perhaps in Great Britain everywhere, they're not in the best of condition, haven't been for many, many years. So there's a lot of lumps and bumps to negotiate. And when you have a hard suspension, and when you get bottoming out, or what feels like bottoming out, it just hurts. So looking into this, if you live in Britain, the call you make is to Hagon in Essex, and you speak to the man himself, who is Dave. He's the maker of shock absorbers. He knows everything. In fact, Dave is a bit of a wizard, and I reckon if you phoned up Hagon and said, "Can I speak to Gandalf?" they'd put you straight through to Dave without a question. Now, when I looked at this for my Sportster, which is a twin shock but the principles are the same, this is what Dave said. On Sportsters, if you were to remove the rear shocks and lift the rear wheel and the swing arm upwards, there is contact when the shock eyes get to 244mm apart. Belt guard to oil tank at 244mm on injected Sportsters, and if you take the belt guard off, the tyre hits the rear mud guard just slightly after. Consequently, the standard shock bottoms out at 250mm to avoid this issue. Therefore, a model with shocks 300mm long only has 50mm of travel, of which 10 to 12mm is bump stop rubber. A typical twin shock would have 80mm of stroke or travel, so if you take that 250mm compressed length and add the typical 80mm of travel, you have an overall length of 330mm or 13 inches, and more importantly, another 30mm of travel. Harley tend to use quite a soft spring with a large amount of preload. This normally makes a harsher ride for very light riders, and a shock which will easily bottom out for anyone 12 stone plus. And of course, anyone riding 2 up is riding on the bump stop. So the bottom line is, it really is cosmetic over comfort. It can't be low and ride great. So the Sportster had 244mm of maximum wheel travel up and down before the wheel hit the bodywork or the belt guard, whatever. So the standard shocks were 250mm minimum length compressed, and that gave 6mm of clearance to make sure nothing touched, which obviously you have to avoid. Now if 80mm of bounce is required, a Sportster shock should be 330mm long, 80 plus 250. If it's less than that, you're going to have bottoming out and topping out, which will make bumps very, very uncomfortable to ride over. If the suspension is more than that, you will get a softer ride, but it does raise the bike up. The seat height becomes higher. On a cruiser, that's not such an issue as it would be on a sports bike. At the end of the day, you wind up with the dichotomy that Dave mentioned, form over function. And as I said 100 times, if the function is required, the form should be adjusted, not the other way around. Now, one thing you'll see if you go onto the forums and look at this issue of suspension is spring type. And to start with, we're going to look at just the two basic springs. There's the standard or linear springs and the progressive springs. In fact, there are more than one sort of progressive spring. But for us today, we're just going to have progressive as an overall umbrella term, and that will work for us. The standard or linear springs, they have a constant and predictable compression rate. That's because the coils are all equispaced. They're regular all the way through the spring. Very straightforward. Progressive springs have a variable compression rate. It might be that the top has very tight coils and the bottom has wider coils. This gives a good transition from little tiny bumps to when you go over a big bump. There's not a step and the suspension can smoothly handle it, and it's a more comfortable ride. So bottoming out and topping out is related to the length of the shock, not the quality or the make of the spring. And you will get, if you go on the forums, people harping on about Öhlins and Wilburs and they're wonderful, the best ever, blah blah blah. They might offer better handling. I wouldn't know, I've never ridden an Öhlins or a Wilburs suspended bike. They might offer better handling, but would they be more comfortable? If we take my old Sportster, the suspension was 297mm or 11.7 inches long. That gave 47mm of travel or 1.85 inches. That's not enough. So if I'd have put 297mm Öhlins on the bike, presumably it would have handled better, but it would have had no impact on the bottoming out. What was needed was 33mm or 1.3 inches of extra suspension length. On the Speedmaster, of course, it's a monoshock. It's not like the old Sportster. It's one single shock absorber up the spine of the bike. Dave says, the physics of a monoshock is completely different as in how much travel to wheel spindle movement is generated. But the principles of wheel travel still apply, as in the more the better, although most bikes have a limit. Since introducing the monoshock version of the Speedmaster, we have had many requests for replacement shocks due to the harsh and unpleasant ride of the standard equipment combined with the limited adjustment. A shock absorber built to your rider weight and type of use should provide a marked improvement across the full range of travel. So even on a monoshock system, a longer suspension is beneficial. But here, Dave says, it's crucial to have a suspension system built precisely to my weight and how I ride. He says it will provide a marked improvement. So you may ask, why are people reluctant to do this? Why don't they put longer suspension on their bikes? Apart from the issue of expense, of course. Well, longer suspension raises the seat height, as I've said, and on something like a scrambler, that would mean your feet don't touch the ground. That makes for a horrible ride. And if you raise the rear of the bike with longer suspension, you might have to raise the front as well to match, because if you raise the rear it changes the bike geometry. And the fact is, a gentler ride requires longer, softer fork springs. And although fork springs themselves aren't expensive, I was quoted 3 hours to change the fork springs because you've got to rebuild the forks. You can't get around that unless you do it yourself, and I'm never ever going to do that. A Speedmaster monoshock, as I said, is the hypotenuse. That's the long side of the triangle. So if you have a long side, say 2 inches longer than normal, it might only actually equate to 1 inch of rise in seat height. It's not such a severe difference, and the Speedmaster is quite a low bike anyway, so wouldn't really matter in my particular case. But as Dave says, suspension needs to be tailor-made, and he says all our standard shocks are built around the average rider weights of 12 to 14 stone, with a reserve of 10 to 12 stone to allow for the average pillion weight. For weights significantly outside of this average, we offer a custom build service. And for instance, on my Sportster, when I had new shocks made, they were 26 kilogram springs from memory, and I found them too hard, so I sent them back and they were changed to 23 kilogram springs, which is something Hagon will do free of charge if you bought your shocks from them. And they also make shocks virtually any length in 10mm increments. so the suspension can be built and tuned very precisely to your requirements, and there are many options for doing so. So what can you say? I've been comparing the Speedmaster with a Sportster, and obviously that's a night and day comparison. The Sportster has legendarily awful suspension. So as you would expect, the Speedmaster is much, much better. I can remember still the first day I rode a Speedmaster on the test ride, and I was in Exeter. It was from Bridge Motorcycles, and I went up the M5, and there's the long bridge there, and there's a metal thing that runs right across the motorway that joins the bridge to the road, and it's a lump, and on the Sportster that got me every time, right up my back. It was awful. But when I went across on the Speedmaster, it was lovely. I thought it was like a hovercraft. So on the Speedmaster, the ride is good, but the rider is feeble. Nevertheless, I say, and many have said, that the ride is harsh. A longer monoshock at the rear would be beneficial, but it needs to be properly built for my specifications, my body weight and how I ride. And a Hagon monoshock is about £400. Hagon fork springs are about £115. But if you have 3 hours for the forks, another hour for the monoshock, what are you talking, £450 labour? That means all upgrades that I've looked at really are £1,000. What a miserable reality. And I should say at this point too, I have no affiliation to Hagon. They don't sponsor me or pay me anything, more's the pity, but they are just so good, and particularly Dave, so I don't mind waving their flag. But at the end of the day, the fact is, suspension is the second most urgent upgrade that I just can't afford.